and welcome to the CDFM study group. Today we're going to be covering CDFM Module 2, and I'll be covering the 2013 study guide. So let's begin on page 2.1.7, and let's look at the Department of Defense mission. It clearly states on the slide what it is: to provide the forces necessary to deter war and to protect this country from the enemy. So a couple of things you need to identify on this page. You see that there are 4 armed services: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine. There are 3 military departments. So don't get confused with military department versus armed services. 3 military departments versus 4 armed services. And then what it says is the mission for the military department is responsible for man, equip, and training those forces necessary. So that's why we have our military. Also looking down, the second paragraph talks about the Office of Management and Budget. So if you can picture the executive branch or the president, their budget office is called OMB, Office of Management and Budget. So all the guidance that the Department of Defense receives when it comes to budget matters comes from OMB. The third paragraph is talking about at the DOD level. So executive branch has OMB, the Department of Defense have the USD Comptroller, Under Secretary of Defense Comptroller. So the key to the CDFM Module 2 is understanding the hierarchy, because there are various moving parts that you're going to look at. This first part of Module 2, Competency 1, covers 60% of this exam. So the difficulty for most is trying to juggle all those key players, the processes, who does what, the final documents, and put it all into place. So the best way to do that is to start from the top. And we can even take it all the way up to Congress. Congress has the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO. Executive branch, President has OMB. DOD has the USD Comptroller. Department of Defense has the Under Secretary of Defense Comptroller. Just keep that hierarchy in mind as we move forward, and then you'll be able to keep things in order. All right, so let's turn to page 2.1.9. It looks at the Department of Defense history, structure. We're not going to go into all that detail. A couple of things I want to point out here. The National Security Act of 1947. That is the law that established the National Security Council. And we're going to look specifically at the NSC later. The CIA, civilian control of the Department of Defense, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So all those military structures that we now have is a result of the National Security Act of 1947. Later down on page 9, you see the function of the Secretary of Defense. What's his job? So the Secretary of Defense is the principal advisor to the President on all defense matters that affect the country. So again, President is a civilian, Secretary of Defense is a civilian. So the SecDef is the principal defense policy advisor to the President. And he also controls, directs those combatant commands, and we're going to look at that in a little bit. So on page 11, you can see a chart that depicts the structure of the Department of Defense, and we're going to actually be looking at specific areas of that hierarchy. So you can see Department of Defense has the Secretary of Defense, he has a legal counsel, you have the various Joint Chief of Staff, the SecDef, Army Department, you have Air Force and so forth, and the defense agencies, such as your commissary, your contracting agency, and so forth. So you can just make sure you kind of orient yourself with the chart to see those. But we're actually going to be looking, so the difficulty of Module 2 is because from that chart on page 11, we have to be able to pull out those key sections and individuals and discuss their functions and what they're responsible for in this whole budgeting process. On page 2.1.12, at the bottom there, you see a list of all those various key players that we're going to be focusing on. So you'll see the Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition Technology and Logistics, the AT&L. We're going to talk about who that individual is. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. We're going to also focus on the USD Comptroller, of course, Resource Manager or Chief Financial Officer. And you're going to consistently see the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DCAPE. Because when it comes to the P process, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution, the DCAPE and all the other individuals I just listed, they have a key role in the P process. So keep that in mind as we move forward. The top of page 13. So we mentioned before when I started, the National Security Act of 1947 created these Joint Chiefs of Staff for Army, Navy. They all had their joint staff. But it wasn't until the Goldwater-Nichols Act on page 13, they did a DOD Reorganization Plan in 1986. That was the point where they identified a chairman. Because think about it, when you have the Joint Chief and they all have equally the same status, it was difficult to try to get things through. So then it required in 1986 a chairman, a commander of the Joint Chief of Staff, to be that one spokesperson for the military. So it's up to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff to analyze all the military requirements, and then he or she would then be the advisor to the Secretary of Defense. So if you look at the role of the chairman, and we're going to look at that on page 14. Actually, let's go ahead and flip to page 2.1.14 at the top. You see the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So it was the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 that created the position of the chairman. And the function of the chairman is the principal military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, the President, and the National Security Council. So President, civilian, Secretary of Defense, civilian. Your military advisor is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So that's where the military comes in. He's a subject matter expert. So chairman of the Joint Chief is the senior military advisor to the SecDef, to the President, to the National Security Council. And we're going to look at the council in a little bit and who makes up that council. So on the bottom of page 14, it says that our chairman also has a vice chairman, second in command. So the vice chairman has a list of functions, and I'm going through these fast because we're going to look at them again in a couple of pages. So you see quickly some of the functions of the vice chairman. So the vice chairman, if you look on page 14, holds the grade of a general. So that's also in uniform. The vice chairman is the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. And I'm going to put all of that in place. So these are various boards and groups that meet together to analyze our requirements. So based on what the President says, the Secretary of Defense says needs to get done, it is the job of the Vice Chairman to check everything and everyone to make sure that we are staying in line with the policies and direction laid out by the Secretary of Defense. And the chairman and the vice chairman, of course, have their joint staff. And the joint staff has members from each of the military services. Thus far, let's recap. We've talked about Congress having the Congressional Budget Office. President has Office of Management and Budget, OMB. Department of Defense, or the SecDef, having the USD Comptroller. We've also talked about the function of the Secretary of Defense is the advisor to the President on all defense matters. Then the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the senior military advisor to the SecDef, to the President, to the National Security Council. We also talked about the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, second in command to make sure that we are all following the policies. So the Vice Chairman is the Chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC. So the next key player on the bottom of page 2.1.16 are our combatant commanders. We understand that the globe, the world, is broken down into various regions, commands. And so our combatant commanders are, again, why the purpose of having a military? To go to war, to defend. So the combatant commanders are an important key player in the budget process when it comes to requirement. At the top of page 17, because operational chain of command runs from the President to the SecDef to the combatant commands. Civilian, civilian, military. So where does the Chairman of the Joint Chief comes in? So the Secretary of Defense is not necessarily communicating directly to the combatant commands, but he communicates through the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff to make sure that whatever the Secretary of Defense wants, needs, is going to be accomplished. He is advised by the Chairman, and the Chairman communicates. But when it comes, what the top of page 17 is saying, when it comes to operational chain of command, since we like chain of command, and we understand that process, it runs directly from the President to the Secretary of Defense to those combatant commanders. So they have those broad continuing missions that they are responsible for. And you see the chart on page 16 that shows your AFRICOM, NORTHCOM, European Command, and so forth and so forth. But I'm not going to focus there. So we have operational control or civilian control of the military. Civilian President, civilian Secretary of Defense controlling the military, which is your combatant commands. So let's move to page 2.1.18. We've been talking about this National Security Council. So let's picture in your head all the way up to the White House, the President. So the National Security Council is the group of individuals that makes up the group that makes up, excuse me. All right, sorry about that. All right, so the National Security Council is the President's forum to determine the security posture of this country. What are we facing? What's our focus? What's our priority? And so at the top of page 19, you have the primary members made up of the President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy. Then you also have the principal advisors, the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which we've already talked about, and a new player, advisor, which is the Director of National Intelligence, your NIA advisor. So you have some standing participants that participate as needed, but make sure you know your primary members of the National Security Council and your statutory advisors. So again, the National Security Council, their job is to sit down, analyze the posture of this country, determine what our focus and our priorities should be. And so the end document that comes out of from the National Security Council is on page 20, 2.1.20, which is the National Security Strategy. So based on the analysis of what type of threat we have to face, what posture we should be in, The National Security Council then develops the national security strategy. So think of an operation order. Your higher command comes up with this great big op order. And what do? We take the operation order from higher, we analyze it, and then we determine what is specific to our organization. So the Department of Defense does the same thing. So at the bottom, starting at the bottom of page 20 and carry on to 21. So once the Department of Defense or the SecDef gets the national security strategy, he then will do a DoD-wide analysis to determine how will the Department of Defense perform its functions and meet the national security strategy. So the end result is the DoD will come up with the national defense strategy. Makes sense. So there's various documents that are developed. So the bottom of page 20 talks about the Quadrennial Defense Review. That is the document that represents DoD strategy for 4 years following a presidential election. Quadrennial, quad meaning 4, summarizes military goals, objectives, and strategy for the upcoming 4 years. So the QDR is required by law to be submitted to Congress. So I'm reading the bottom of page 20 in February of the second year of a presidential administration. The QDR identifies defense goals and forms a basis for the defense strategic guidance. So big picture, we start with the National Security Council, President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy, advised by the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the Director of Intelligence. The National Security Strategy comes from the National Security Council. The Secretary of Defense takes the NSS, National Security Strategy, and then develops the DoD strategy, which is published in the Quadrennial Defense Review. That's kind of recapping, getting you where you need to get to. So once the QDR strategy document is developed on page 21, the Defense Strategic Guidance is the Secretary's Defense response to the President's direction in the National Security Strategy. Some other documents that come out of this. On the bottom of 21, the National Military Strategy. Now, the key thing here with the NMS is understand the Secretary of Defense does not write the National Military Strategy. Who do you think write the National Military Strategy? Who is the senior military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, the President, and the National Security Council? The Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So what it's saying on the bottom of 21 is that the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the author of the National Military Strategy. So depending on whatever the defense strategy is, objective, the Chairman of the Joint Chief now have to determine what the military strategy is going to be to meet the defense strategy, and the defense strategy needs to meet the national security strategy. Just like an op order. We might be doing our own thing, but what we're doing must be in line with what our higher command is trying to accomplish. Some other guidance that comes out of after the National Security Strategy and the Quadrennial Report, strategy for homeland defense. How are we going to define or defend our own people, our own communities? And so we use the P process. You will see on page 2.1.22, the Ppbe overview. The planning, programming, budget, and execution. That is the resource allocation process that the Department of Defense use to determine how are we going to pay for the things that we develop in the strategy. So we have a strategy, which we need to develop a plan. And from the plan, we need to determine what our requirements are. Well, guess what? We don't have unlimited funding, so we need to determine and prioritize things to figure out when are we going to need these items and when are we going to pay for them. So on 22, it talks about Ppbe processes used to acquire, allocate, account for, and analyze personnel and financial resources for the Department of Defense. So we have to look at what current personnel requirements we have. What do we need to get the job done? Ppbe is also the process DoD uses to determine the dollar amounts. So we're going to need to determine how much money are we going to need in what fiscal year to get that strategy accomplished. So ultimately, the last paragraph at the bottom of 22, the ultimate objective of Ppbe is to provide the entire Defense Department with the most effective mix of forces, equipment, that's our manpower, and support attainable with the fiscal constraints that we have. That is the objective of the Ppbe process, which we commonly say the P process. All right, so on page 23 now, we're getting ready to go into some additional key players in the Ppbe process. So we talked about we get our policies, fiscal constraint policies from the Secretary of Defense. We also talked about the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, being the military advisor, writes the national military strategy. But he writes the strategy, hands it over to the Secretary of Defense for inclusion in the defense strategy. We don't get any strategy directly from the chairman. The chairman is an advisor. So let's take it over to page 2.1.25. So we've talked about Secretary and Deputy Secretary of Defense. What do we get from the Secretary and Deputy Secretary? We get policy and fiscal guidance. The next key player, Joint Chief of Staff and Combatant Commanders. A couple things that are said there. So the Joint Chief of Staff, we get guidance. So both the Joint Chief of Staff and Combatant Commanders play a major role in this P process. They have input. So the Joint Staff develops the national military strategy. So no, the chairman doesn't write it himself, just like a commander. So he has representative from Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine. That's the Joint Staff. They help develop the national military strategy. The senior person on the Joint Staff, which is the chairman of the Joint Staff, signs off on it, takes it over to the Secretary of Defense. So on 25, it says Joint Staff writes the national military strategy, and then that NMS is then used to issue Defense Planning Guidance, DPG. Additionally, in that paragraph, the combatant commanders, what their input document is called is an integrated priority list. So the word integrated, combatant commanders don't have their own troops or resources. They get resources from the services. So they have an integrated priority list of resource requirements that are prioritized across the services and functional lines that they need. So these IPLs are submitted to the Secretary of Defense, Deputy SecDef, Chairman of the Joint Staff, Chief of Staff, and the military departments that are responsible for that particular function. All right, any question there? All right, so I'm kind of feeling you out here, understanding. Secretary of Defense gives fiscal guidance and policy. Joint Staff gives us the national military strategy. Combatant Commanders gives us the integrated priority list that lists what they need for their region, whether it's by function, personnel, capabilities, and then they send a copy of the IPL to the SecDef, Deputy SecDef, the Combatant Commander would also send a copy to the services and military department that is responsible for that capability. Bottom of page 25 talks about the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. We talked about the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Senior Military Advisor to the Secretary of Defense, the President, and the National Security Council. Now we have the Vice Chairman, and I touched on it already, that the Vice Chairman has a couple of hats that he holds. Now that we receive guidance from the Secretary of Defense, the Vice Chairman is responsible for keeping his hands on pulse on everything to make sure that all of us are in line. So the couple of roles that he holds, the Vice Chairman serves as the Vice Chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board and Chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. The JROC reviews long-range defense strategy and evaluates the requirements for new weapon systems or information systems. So the purpose of the Vice Chairman is to link the long-range requirements plus near-term requirement and kind of see what capabilities do we have, what do we need to request, and make sure that everything falls in line with each other. So you have the heads of the agencies. So I'm going to discuss something that we probably won't see until a little bit later, but I think I need to point it out here. So the Department of Defense has 3 support systems that we use, and they kind of intertwine with each other. And actually, let me find it. It might be easier to show you. There we go. Page 2.1.30. The DoD Decision Support System. So there are 3 systems, and I'm gonna do them out of order because it kind of makes more sense the way I do it. So the first system, the bottom of page 30, is the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, JCID. That is a system used by the chairman and the joint staff to analyze the situation and determine the capability gaps. So they look at what needs to get done, they look at what we currently have, and then they find if there's a capability gap out there that we need to address. Once we identify the capability gap, we identify the requirements, then we use the Ppbe system to resource and to pay for that particular requirement. How are we going to get it into that cycle, a POM cycle? The third system on top of page 31 is the Defense Acquisition System. Sometimes we do not have a capability already in our inventory. So we need to acquire that. We need to develop something new. So once we do the JCIDs, we identify what we have, what we don't have, what we need. If it's something we just need to pay for, we go through the P process, POM process, do it. Additionally, if it's something we don't already have in the inventory, we need to also use the acquisition system to determine how we can acquire that item, and we go back again to the P process to figure out how to pay for the acquisition. So you see the chart on page 30, how those circles intertwine and overlap with one another because they work hand in hand. So now we can go back to page 25. So the job of the Vice Chairman of the Joint Staff is to make sure that all 3 of those systems continue to overlap, and they are also working towards the same purpose. So that is why, going back, the Vice Chairman is a Vice Chair of the Defense Acquisition Board. So on the acquisition system, he is Chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board, and he is also Chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So the council that reviews all of our requirements. What do we need? You analyze it. Do we have it? He's the chairman of that also. And then provides oversight for the Ppbe process. So you have the heads of the agencies on page 26. You go into the chief financial officer, the individual responsible for the budgeting and the execution phase of Ppbe is the USD comptroller. All right, so we talked about JSIDs, the joint staff being responsible for that. And on page 26, USD comptroller, when you read through all of that, chief financial officer, principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense on budget matters, is responsible for, when we talk about plan, program, budget execution, the USD comptroller is responsible for the budget and the execution phase of the Ppbe process. Page 27 looks at the Undersecretary of Defense for policy. When you read through that, you will see the USD for policy is responsible for the planning phase of Ppbe. And I'm going to put this back in line because you see it's kind of out of order. So you'll review that. Let's take it over to page 28. The Undersecretary of Defense Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics, the USD AT&L, is the one that's, remember I talked about the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff being co-chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board? Well, the other chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board on 28 is the USD AT&L. Another key player on page 29, the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, DCAPE, is responsible for the programming phase and updating the future year defense program, FYDP, FYDP, same thing. And so, okay, so let me recap this, and I'm going to put it, even, it's out of order here, I'm going to put it in order for you. All right, so here we go. Secretary of Defense and Deputy SecDef, we get policy and fiscal guidance. Let's think about the Ppbe process. Let's think about JSID. So I said Joint Capability Integration Development System, which identifies requirements and capability gaps, is the control of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which is really the vice chairman who does the work. So the planning phase is controlled by the USD for policy. Programming is responsibility of the Director of CAPE. The budget and execution phase of Ppbe is the responsibility of the USD comptroller. On the Defense Acquisition System, the Undersecretary of Defense, AT&L, Acquisition Technology and Logistics, is the chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board, and he has a co-chairman, which is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Your combatant commanders provide their input into this resourcing phase by issuing the Integrated Priority List, the IPLs, and submits a copy to the Secretary of Defense, Deputy SecDef, the Joint Chief of Staff, and the military department responsible for that capability. So I think I've covered all of what we just discussed. And what's the job of the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff? To link your long-term requirements and your short-term needs to ensure that everything is in sync and we have timelines to be able to resource the requirements so that we can pay for things when we need them. And it's in that Ppbe process, that POM process that we are involved in.